Hello, everyone. We are really excited to have you join us today for a new session of our ACE exam webinar series. I am Doina Tato from Cloud Academy, and I'm happy to introduce you our very amazing AWS experts, our senior AWS certification specialist, Danny Jesse, and our senior AWS content creator, Carlos Rivas, who will take you through all the latest updates to the AWS Certified DevOps Engineer Professional Certification exam. Before we start, I'd like to remind you a few things. First of all, remember that at the end of the session, we will have a live Q&A. So please don't forget to submit your questions in the question box. You can submit them even from the beginning. At the end, we're gonna try to go through as many as possible. Secondly, remember that this webinar will be recorded and shared with you via email within the next 36 hours. And last but not least, at the conclusion of today's webinar, there will be a brief survey, and we'd really love to have your feedback there. It will help us improve the content we offer and your future webinar experience. So please take a moment to fill that out. That's all from me for now. So without further ado, I'll let Danny and Carlos take it from here.
Thank you so much, Doina, and thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the month of March, and welcome to this ACE the Exam webinar. As Doina mentioned, we're going to be going through the latest updates to the AWS Certified DevOps Engineer Professional Certification exam, which has the new exam code DOP-C02. So again, I am Danny Jesse. I'm an AWS Certification Specialist here at Cloud Academy, and I'm joined by Carlos Rivas. If you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Carlos, and as it says right there, I'm a senior content creator here at Cloud Academy, and I specialize in DevOps, so I'm particularly excited about this exam conversation, Danny.
All right, well, without further ado, we have a lot to get to in this hour, so let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
So let's talk about our agenda for today. So we're going to talk through some of the exam details for the DOP-C02 exam. We'll go through the exam guide and the 6 domains that are outlined in the exam guide. We'll go through all of the services that are covered and just some subject areas to focus on. We'll talk through how to tackle the exam questions. So once you're sitting in front of that screen and question 1 appears in front of you, we'll give you some strategies for how to make sure that you are maximizing your score on the exam. We'll talk through exam logistics, such as booking your certification exam and what that entails. We'll go through a list of some of the frequently asked questions that we often get here at Cloud Academy about this certification and certification exams in general. And then, as Doina said, we'll wrap up with a live Q&A session. So we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So for the exam details, registration opened up for this exam back on January 31st. So it is available to register for now. It is not available to sit just yet. The first day you can sit this updated exam is next Tuesday, March 7th. As with the other professional certification exams, so there's the Solutions Architect Professional and the DevOps Engineer Professional. Both of those exams have a minimum passing score of 750 out of 1,000. So the way that the scoring works on these exams, it is a scaled scoring exam. And that means basically not all questions are going to be weighted equally. And in fact, everyone who takes the exam is going to get a different subset of questions. Those questions are going to have different weightings associated with them. So you can roughly consider it a 75% pass, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. And unfortunately, you don't find out exactly how many questions you got right or wrong. You do just get that score report, usually within a day or two of finishing the exam. So the professional level exams are 75 questions. If you've sat the associate exams, you know those are 65, but you do get a little bit more time. You get 180 minutes, so a total of 3 hours to complete those questions. And of those 75 questions, only 65 of them are going to count towards your final score. So 10 of those questions are unscored content. Unfortunately, they don't tell you which ones count and which ones don't. So you do need to answer them all as if they all count, because there's no way to know. Most of the questions that you receive are going to be multiple choice. So the professional level exams tend to ask lengthier questions than you might have experienced on the associate level exams in the past. But they're still going to have 4 answer options, and of those 4 answers, 1 will be correct. And then there will also be a handful of multiple response questions, and those will have 5 or 6 different answer choices with 2 or 3 being correct. And unfortunately, on those multiple response questions, there is no partial credit. So if it's a choose 2 or a choose 3 and you only get 1 of them correct, unfortunately, it's an all or nothing proposition. It's either completely right or completely wrong. There's no partial credit. And this exam is a little bit more expensive than the associates. It's $300 US. But if you have passed an associate level or any other AWS certification, you do get that 50% off voucher to help bring that cost down. Anything you want to add here, Carlos?
Yes, I would like to throw in that there is no penalty for attempting a question. So if you don't know the answer to a question, feel free to at least take a guess if you have time near the end. So there is no penalty for for that. So don't leave questions just empty.
That's a great point. And also, if you do the math on the 75 questions in 180 minutes, that gives you roughly 2.5 minutes per question. So that may seem like a lot, but it is something you'll want to be mindful of. There'll be that little countdown clock up in the top corner of the screen as you're taking the exam, counting down that 180 minutes you have. Be mindful of that, particularly in the early questions. Make sure you're not spending 5, 10, 15 minutes on the early questions and kind of forcing yourself to rush through towards the end. So time management also is important there. So now we're going to go through each of the 6 domains that are outlined in the official exam guide, and there's a link to that exam guide at the top of this slide here. So this exam has 6 domains: SDLC automation, configuration management, and IAC, which is infrastructure as code. So for domain 1, SDLC is the software development lifecycle. Domain 3, resilient cloud solutions. Domain 4, monitoring and logging. Then we have incident and event response, and security and compliance. And the questions that you receive on the exam aren't going to necessarily just cover a single domain per question. There's often going to be overlap within multiple questions. So, you see 22% of the 75 questions will involve SDLC automation in some way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only domain that will be addressed within the question. So we'll start by talking about domain 1. So like I said, software development lifecycle automation. It does account for 22% of the exam content. That makes sense on a DevOps exam. You're going to be focusing on everything from implementing continuous integration, continuous delivery, or CI/CD pipelines, how to go about integrating automated testing into those pipelines, building and managing the different development artifacts. That can be everything from your code in a code commit repository, could be external dependencies, other libraries, objects and files that need to be stored in association with your applications, and also deployment strategies for instance, container, and serverless environments. So you see we have that list of services of interest on the side there. Obviously, all of the code-focused services, code pipeline, code build, code commit, code artifact, code deploy. The focus points for the questions that you're going to see are going to involve everything from setting up code commit repositories, setting up proper permissions, incorporating code commit actions into a CI/CD pipeline. So for instance, if I wanted to kick off a build every time I checked in a change to my source code, how could I leverage code pipeline? What other AWS services would I need to leverage as part of that? As well as taking that to the next level with instance and container image builds. So using things like the EC2 image builder to build an EC2 image, and configuring different deployment methods. So you'll see a lot of questions around what is the best strategy for deployment given these constraints? Do we use a blue-green deployment? Do we do something with an all at once or a canary or immutable deployments? All of those kinds of things will factor in there. Anything you want to add there, Carlos?
Yes, there's a lot of failure management as well. So you just said, for example, blue-green deployments, they're going to put that into a context of failure. For example, they might give you, what can you do with Route 53 if you have a multi-region deployment? If you have something running on the East Coast and something running on the West Coast, what can you do with Route 53 to route customers to the nearest location or to the nearest non-failing location and things like that? So you'll see a lot talk about health checks and, as you mentioned, blue-green deployments, as well as load balance. Plenty of load balancing there's going to be here. So whether you're load balancing containers or just straight up EC2s, you're going to see a lot of that. So just keep those structures in mind and how you deploy them in AWS.
Great points all around, and I think you might even see in one of the sample questions we go through later, many of the things you just mentioned are going to factor into how we go about answering that question. I'm going to hand it over to you now for domain 2, configuration management and infrastructure as code.
I see that this one dropped a little bit in percentage. I guess there's so much more to cover. And I also see the CDK on my screen here as well. The reason why that is because in the past, and I say the past, I'm talking like 1 year, 2 years ago, it was just pretty much just CloudFormation. That was it, right? But over time, they're realizing, well, it's no longer just infrastructure as code. Now we're talking about infrastructure is actual code, and that's when the CDK or Cloud Development Kit comes in. I'll tell you right now, do not worry about a specific code concerns, simply because if you're a Python developer, the people writing the exam, they cannot assume that you are a Python developer. They could say, well, you know, a person could know the CDK, but they use it in Java, they use it in C#. They don't use it necessarily with Python, even TypeScript, for example. So don't worry, there's not going to be like actual specific coding questions, but just be aware about this product, the CDK, which is essentially the next evolution from CloudFormation when it comes to infrastructure as code. Since we're talking about configuration management, AWS config and CloudTrail, those are going to play a very, very significant role here. They're going to ask you questions like, hey, something changed in your environment during the night. Did you get an alert? And how can you set up an alert when something actually changes and you're not looking at your environment? You know, things like that. So in those cases, yeah, those tools are going to be your primary there. I also see automating inventory, configuration, patching. You're going to see a lot of systems manager, not just config, because config can help you detect something's going on out there. But when you actually need to take action, you're going to need to go to those SSM tools or system manager tools available to you in AWS. You need to be aware of those things out there. There's going to be plenty of database troubleshooting and multi-region deployment, things like that. That's going to play a significant role because they're going to ask you, hey, you know, you have this environment, which is your development environment, and you have this other environment, which is your production. How are you going to keep them, you know, true to each other? And that's when something like AWS config comes to mind, where you'll be able to say, well, you know, I want to make sure that nothing changes. How can I keep track of every little change that happens to this set of EC2s from one environment to the other? And always the answer is going to be AWS config for you. And of course, they're going to ask you a question like, okay, you have to patch this 50 Windows servers all at once. What are you going to do? Are you going to SSH manually into each one, or, you know, or do remote desktop connection? And again, think of automation as much as possible, because that's going to be a key theme throughout. And of course, going back to hitting the point of infrastructure as code, whether it's CloudFormation or CDK, everything that you do, just try to think, well, I need to be able to replicate this environment in the future. How am I going to do that? Is by automating the creation of your infrastructure, and you can do that using these two particular tool, CloudFormation and the CDK. I see AWS organizations here in the slide. I don't remember all that much talking about it, but you might see a lot of SCPs or service control policies, and the way to enforce those in your organization is to actually have a proper AWS organizations deployment all throughout. And usually the way I've seen people use it is they'll have a top level AWS org with a control tower deployment, and then various development account, sandbox account, production accounts, and then enforce what happens within those AWS environments using SCPs or service control policies. So again, when you see something like SCPs, think of AWS organizations. That's the way that it might come up in an exam situation. What do you think, Dan?
Absolutely. All good points all around. And also I would add with things like organizations, just having a general understanding of how to manage multi-account environments, how to structure things like organizational units. You could have a company that has different OUs for development and for production accounts, potentially needing to know how to set up things like IAM policies and being able to grant access across accounts as well.
Something that might come up, Danny, is that, for example, you may have one of those that you mentioned, let's say a developer account with full admin rights within their own account, but the limitations come in as deny policies from the top level OU or the overall AWS organization. So it's a way, to really test your skills during an exam. They might say something like, hey, you're trying to do something and you have a full admin IAM policy, but it's still not working. What could be preventing this from working? And one of the options is probably going to be, well, there's a deny policy somewhere at the organization level. And, just remember this when you face a question like that, whether in the real world or an exam.
Absolutely. So we'll move on. We'll talk about domain 3, resilient cloud solutions. And the idea here, of course, we're talking about how to implement solutions that are highly available and resilient to failure. And that could be depending on the requirements given in a specific question. It could be resilient to failure at an availability zone level. It could be resilient to failure at a regional level. So this domain is going to test your ability to implement solutions that can scale to meet business requirements, but also recover within defined RTO and RPO, so recovery time objective and recovery point objective constraints. So this is a little bit like what Carlos was talking about after domain 1, knowing how to use services like elastic load balancing, understanding that things like application load balancers are within a single region. So if you had a question involving a cross-region scenario and one of the answers implies that you can set up an application load balancer with target groups that span regions, obviously you know that that is not feasible. Also how to leverage services like Route 53 and CloudFront for your globally available applications, and how you can use some of the different things like routing policies within Route 53, setting up data residency requirements. So you might have a requirement that data for a particular game or application needs to be stored in the region where the users reside. So how to leverage things like S3 buckets with cross-region replication, things of that nature, using CloudFront for globally available deployments and static website hosting and all of those kinds of things as well. Anything you want to add there?
Yes, I'd like to mention, emphasize what you just said about cross-region, because it might come up in some other ways as well. One example is AWS backups, right? They might ask you, hey, what do you need to do to set up these backups and make them available in the other region? You need to be aware that whatever service that might be in the question is actually supports cross-region. Another one would be KMS. It's like, can you use this KMS key in a different region? Or as you mentioned, S3. S3 is definitely one of those that supports multi-region. So if there's a multi-region question, it's going to involve S3 most likely. So just keep that in mind, that when it comes to disaster recovery, cross-region is one of your friends. If you want to keep it local, then of course cross-AZ is certainly going to be part of the design all the time.
Absolutely, and knowing all of your different DR strategies. So, in some instances, a pilot light setup might be appropriate. In others, you may need a warm standby. The question is usually going to lead you to a particular solution based on whether cost is the priority or recovery time objective is the priority. Based on whether you need to have that standby infrastructure ready to go, or if you do have enough time to maybe restore a snapshot and spin up some EC2 instances. The question is going to usually guide you towards what the appropriate answer is. But it's important to keep in mind as you read through the question that you do pay attention to whether it is asking you which is the most cost effective, which one is the most automated, which one is allows for the fastest restore time, because many of the times you're going to see answers where multiple answers are correct, and the true correct answer to the question is going to be driven by, is this cost effective? Is this the quickest restore time? Things of that nature.
Yeah, and it's usually active is the one that involves cross region.
Absolutely. So I'll hand it back over to you for domain 4, monitoring and logging.
Absolutely. When it comes to monitoring and logging, your number one thing is going to be actual logs, collecting logs. And you're going to hear a lot about CloudWatch and CloudWatch Agent, because obviously you're going to be collecting logs, and those logs are going to end up somewhere. Most likely, they're going to end up in an S3 bucket. And if that comes up, well, then now you have all these analytics tools, such as Athena and other tools where you can actually do queries on your data in S3. But just be aware that CloudWatch, you can do all kinds of analysis just within CloudWatch alone. Another thing that AWS likes to emphasize is the use of metrics. You have to collect metrics at all times. So yeah, that's certainly going to be a number one thing. Why? Because metrics can help you create alarms. And then with those alarms, you can create automation. I don't think at this point we'll ever see again something like CloudWatch events. Now it's called Event-Bridge. Just be aware, that's the number one tool that you're going to be using to be able to react to events. Alarms. So CPU is too high, memory consumption is too high. Those things are going to create alarms, and they're going to trigger events, and that's how you're going to respond to those things. But to get to that point, you need to be able to monitor and collect logs. So there's going to be an emphasis on those things. So again, I'm going to tell you the same thing. How do you configure an alarm? Very simple, but you need the metric first. You need to be able to have a criteria to create this alarm. And yeah, that's when CloudWatch is going to help you. I'll switch gear to talking about CloudTrail. Whenever I say CloudTrail, people think of a security tool to be able who logged in at what time. That's not exactly it. In CloudTrail, you'll have a particular trace of every single activity that concerns the AWS API. So meaning that you can use it for other things. So if you have, in fact, AWS config, I don't think it even works if you don't have CloudTrail enabled. So yeah, there's going to be plenty of conversation about CloudTrail. They might even ask you, how do you protect your CloudTrail information? How do you make it tamper-proof? The reason why that is because if somebody, a bad actor, gets into your AWS environment, one of the first things they're going to try is to turn off CloudTrail so that they can work kind of behind the scenes. So you have to be able to make your CloudTrail data tamper-proof. And there's many ways to do that. So, just be aware of those things. Those are tools that are at your disposal, and they're certainly going to come up in an exam situation for you right there. So just having those things in mind, that should get you through this particular domain 4. Did I miss anything, Danny?
I think you covered everything, and that's a great point about CloudTrail and the log file integrity validation as well. Maybe knowing about the AWS config managed policy that you can put in place to be able to react to that CloudTrail being disabled event if there were a bad actor who were doing that. And that all kind of segues into the next domain, which is domain 5, which is incident and event response. So managing event sources to process and notify and take action in response to events. So typical event-driven architectures in the AWS cloud, leveraging services like SNS, SQS, and step functions. Obviously, Event-Bridge plays a role in that as well, as Carlos mentioned earlier, setting up those different alarms, running different tasks on a schedule using an Event-Bridge schedule, implementing configuration changes in response to events, and troubleshooting system and application failures. So making sure that you have those alarms in place, having those notifications in place to be able to find out when there may be a failure that's impacting the availability of an application, something like that. So things you want to focus on, everything from identifying all of the different sources of event data in AWS, knowing the basics of event-driven architectures, event processing workflows, understanding that SNS, the simple notification service, is the service that's leveraged for notifications and not SES, the simple email service. I've seen that come up as a distractor a couple of times. Knowing fleet and configuration management services, which we talked about a little bit in the previous domains as well, and being able to analyze failed deployments. So again, this, knowing about the basics of event processing workflows, knowing how to leverage EventBridge, and then setting up those notifications using a service like SNS. Anything to add there?
Absolutely. Usually they would ask you a very, very harmless and simple looking question, something like, what would you do if you found out that one of your EC2s right now is compromised? And they'll give you ideas, like, hey, could you go ahead and just terminate it or just stop it and things like that. And of course, you can't just delete it because you'll never know what happened. So in environments like this, it might be a good idea, and this is certainly might come up. It's like, hey, do you have a subnet that doesn't have any routing where you could actually deploy something in there and make it live, certain EC2, but without any connectivity to anywhere? That would be what they will consider like an incident that's going on. And having this and being able to snapshot the machine and be able to replicate it as many times as needed, just to understand how the breach happened, is something that's going to come up. So when it comes to incidents, just think about EC2s being compromised. That's the number one thing that's going to come up there for you. Just something to keep in mind.
And also talking about EC2 in conjunction with auto-scaling, you could see a question along the lines of auto-scaling is terminating instances, but there's some sort of an issue that's taking place, and because these instances are being terminated by auto-scaling, you're not able to actually do any sort of inspection of the logs on these instances before auto-scaling is terminating them. So understanding the auto-scaling lifecycle hooks and how to tie into those for the pending and for the terminating states for these EC2 instances to be able to stop those lifecycle events from happening. If you need to get into the instance, or you need to pull the logs from the instance, do some further analysis, things of that nature as well. And last but not least, Carlos will talk us through Domain 6, Security and Compliance.
You know me, I love security, and I'm being sarcastic at this time.
All developers love security. What are you talking about?
Exactly. There's going to be plenty of IAM. However, as times evolves and things change, yes, we're going to be talking about IAM. We're going to be talking about policies. We're going to be talking about roles. Those things are going to be there all the time. However, now you might see something like, well, we have this AWS SSO or a single sign-on. This is certainly going to come up because it's such a popular tool these days that you can use to leverage existing identity sources such as Active Directory. Every company, no matter how small, they usually have some sort of Windows servers with Active Directory to manage identities, and now you can leverage that in AWS with SSO. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. And IAM is not going to go away because IAM is going to map an IAM role into this particular SSO identity, so that's never going to go away. If we're talking about a larger deployment of identities, then of course you're going to have multiple environments, and that's when AWS Security Hubs comes in. When you have an AWS organization at the top level, you're going to have Security Hub monitoring all these accounts and taking a look at AWS config that's running on every one of these environments, just keeping things centralized and secure. There's going to be talk about networks for sure. You're going to see plenty of conversations about what do I do? What can I do with this AWS VPC flow logs? It's like I want to be able to find all this deny events or this allow events, and those are going to be tracked in your VPC flow logs. Now, because this is DevOps, there's going to be a developer side of things, And that's where something like Secrets Manager is going to come in. They might throw you off and say, hey, we have this sensitive information, and just put it in code commit or GitHub. And if you see something like that, you should know that you should never store any sensitive information in a code repository. Even in a code build deployment, you should never put that information directly there. All sensitive data should be either in the parameter store or the AWS Secrets Manager. They might throw you off as well regarding okay, how do we change that password? Now that we have it in the proper place, how do we change the password? And that's when you need to remember that AWS Secrets Manager has a feature for auto rotation where it will change passwords automatically for you every X number of days. So again, something to keep in mind. And of course, the main thing is going to be least privilege, meaning that can you write an IAM policy that just gives the person enough access to do their jobs and nothing else. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to quiz you around service control policies, which is essentially an IAM policy that's more global in nature for the entire organization. So that's certainly going to come up. So again, policies for IAM roles as well. When it comes to network, yes, you might see the firewall as well as the other security tools as well, such as guard duty, for example. Those will come up. And there's another one, Danny, that I'm forgetting. The other tool that allows you to do cost analysis so that you're right sizing your environment, and it can also help you detect things like, hey, you don't have MFA enabled for your root users and things like that. That's another one that comes up a lot for sure.
Yeah, so Trusted Advisor is definitely a covered service for the exam. It's important to know what those basic alerts are that you can get from Trusted Advisor, and how Trusted Advisor can even be used as an event source for some of the event-driven architectures you might have needed to put together for Domain 5.
That's the one, yes.
And I think that pretty well covers Domain 6. Also, you may see a question or two around AWS WAF and Shield. So just knowing kind of the basic use cases for those within your application architectures for your web apps as well. So those are the 6 domains from the exam guide. I know that was a lot. So now we're gonna take a step back. We're gonna talk through how to tackle these exam questions. So it's time to take the exam. Question 1 is on the screen in front of you. How do we go about answering these questions? First, we want to start by stripping down the question, removing any information that is not relevant. And what I mean by that, and in particular on the professional exams, I mentioned that these questions tend to be a bit longer than the ones you see on the associate level exams. AWS likes to be a little bit wordy with these questions sometimes. So you might see a question that starts with something like, a major financial institution hosts its online banking application in AWS. Well, that may be nice to know, but is probably likely not really relevant to what the question is asking. In general, it's usually the last few words at a professional level exam, maybe the last couple of sentences of the question. So be sure, these, like I said, these are longer questions. Kind of keep that mental toughness as you're reading through the question. Don't lose focus, because as the question goes on, you're likely going to be given more and more information that's actually relevant to what the question is asking. So once you've made it through the question, you want to look through all of the answer choices. Even if answer A looks to be the absolute correct answer, don't just choose A and move on. You have to at least go through all of those answer choices at least once. As part of that process, you can obviously remove answers that are clearly incorrect. But generally speaking, you're going to see at least 2, if not all of the answers are going to be plausible in some sense. So once you've narrowed that selection down, maybe you've had 4 answers to choose from, and now you're convinced it's 1 of 2 or 3 of them. Reread the question. Now you see the answers may be pointing you in a specific direction, or maybe may present a choice between 2 different services or 2 different approaches. Now that you know what the answer options are, go back and reread the question with that in mind, and then choose that correct answer and continue that process. You can iterate through that process a couple times if you need to. Again, being mindful that you do have about 2.5 minutes per question as you are taking this exam. But as Carlos also mentioned at the beginning, never leave a question unanswered. There's never a penalty for guessing. Under no circumstances should you ever leave a question blank. Anything you want to add there?
Yes, Danny. I like to take advantage of something that you said, which is the domain overlap. So, for example, if I have 4 possible choices for the valid answer, let's say the question involves looking for changes that happen in my environment when I wasn't looking, and I know, well, the answer is going to involve AWS config because I'm looking for changes that happen in my environment. Now, you'll see out of your 4 choices, most likely 2 of those have AWS config somewhere in the text. You can more or less say, okay, I don't want to even look at the other 2; those are kind of invalid there, and that will point you towards the right answer. Again, you'll never be like 100% certain this is the answer because that's how AWS likes to do it. You'll have like one that is the most correct. But yeah, that's a way to eliminate incorrect ones right away, is to just look for those things that you know for sure about the answer, and then just concentrate on what you don't know until you hit the target.
And some other important things to look for that can help you remove those obviously incorrect answers: anything that involves storing credentials in code, anything that involves storing keys in an S3 bucket, things like that. Are obvious distractors that they throw in there. Obviously, all of us doing our due diligence studying for these exams know for a fact what the best practices are, but they do like to throw those in there sometimes. So now that we've talked through how to tackle some of these exam questions, let's go through. We've chosen 3 sample questions, and these are from the official AWS sample questions for the exam. So what we're going to do is we're going to read through the question and the possible answers here, and then we're going to talk through how to use some of these strategies we've discussed to arrive at the correct answer. So question 1, a company controls the source code for an application in AWS Code Commit. The company is creating a CI/CD pipeline for the application by using AWS Code Pipeline. The pipeline must start automatically when changes occur to the main branch of the code commit repository. Changes occur frequently every day, so the pipeline must be as responsive as possible. What should a DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? The choices are: configure the pipeline to periodically check the repository's main branch for changes, start the pipeline when changes are detected. Configure an Amazon Event Bridge rule to detect changes to the repository's main branch. Configure the pipeline to start in response to the changes. Configure the repository to periodically run an AWS Lambda function. Configure the function to check the repository's main branch and to start the pipeline when the function detects changes. Or configure the repository to publish a notification to an SNS topic when changes occur to the repository's main branch. Subscribe the pipeline to the SNS topic. So this does give you a sense of the wordiness of the questions. There isn't too much unnecessary info in this one in particular, though. The idea being we have a CI/CD pipeline in place using Code Pipeline. They use Code Commit for their source control. We need the pipeline to kick off automatically whenever changes occur within a specific branch in our Code Commit repository. So how do we do this as responsively as possible given that changes occur frequently? So armed with all of that information, how can we narrow down this list of 4 possible answers?
I would love to start by eliminating a couple of them, Danny. And I like to call them the duct tape solution. Like when they try to take several AWS services and just throw them together like a word salad just to distract you from the actual answer. So for example, I personally don't like the idea of using something like SNS in this case. Like, why would I use SNS? That doesn't sound like fast or efficient, and doesn't seem to be a service that is related at all to a code repository, right? Especially to tie it to something like a main branch event or something like that. That's not something that I would choose. So that helps me very relatively quickly eliminate option D, the last one off the list, right off the bat, right? Would you agree, Danny?
Absolutely, and it would help to know as well that you can't necessarily do something like subscribe a code pipeline to an SNS topic. So any number of ways we could rule that one out.
I
Now, what I
wonder
would
if we
consider
can.
to be another potential duct tape solution is the introduction of Lambda into this process. So,
Exactly. That sounds like writing code to write code. It's like I'm gonna write
right.
code to monitor my code. Yeah, that's certainly not a good choice there for sure. So as you can see, very quickly and relatively quickly, because we're as you mentioned, we're like less than 3 minutes to figure the whole thing out and move on. We can get rid of the last two, and then okay, what can we do about the top two? Because we know that the answer is in there somewhere, right?
That's right. So this sounds like an event-driven architecture. So answer A, configure the pipeline to periodically check the repository's main branch for changes. Start the pipeline when changes are detected. It sounds nice enough, but it seems like there's a piece that's missing to that one.
Absolutely, yeah.
So using that process of elimination, let's look at answer B, configure an event bridge rule to detect changes to the repository's main branch. Configure the pipeline to start in response to the changes. So again, having that awareness, having that knowledge of the capabilities of these services, knowing that something like a change to a branch in a code commit repository is a valid event source for an event bridge rule. Based on all of that, we know that the answer we're looking for here is answer B.
And that would be obvious if somebody actually if you use AWS Code Pipeline on a daily basis, this option B would be totally obvious in this case.
Right, so this is where they're testing, and again, in particular with the professional level exams, for the associate level, having just sort of basic experience, they say maybe up to 1 year of experience using these services, but for the professional level exam, they expect you to have 2 years of experience at least. And so hopefully in the course of 2 years of experience with these services, you've been able to get familiar enough, work with them enough to understand what their capabilities are, what the best practices are, how to properly use them. So let's take a look at another question here. A development team is designing an application that has a large customer base spread across 3 AWS regions. The application will use an Amazon DynamoDB table that must be available in all 3 regions to deliver low latency data access. When the table is updated in one region, the changes must seamlessly propagate to the other regions. How should a DevOps engineer configure the table to meet these requirements with the least operational overhead? Create a DynamoDB table in each of the 3 regions, give each table the same name. Configure 3 DynamoDB tables in each of the 3 regions. Use the AWS SDK for DynamoDB to synchronize data changes among the tables. Configure a multi-region, multi-active DynamoDB global table that includes the 3 regions. Or use DynamoDB global tables to configure a primary table in one region and a read replica in each of the other regions. So how can we narrow these down?
Well, I'll just tell you that you just need to create one table in the 3 regions and you're done. This is over. It's obviously A, and we're done here. Of course, I'm being sarcastic again.
Maybe it is, right? But maybe we should look at them all just to be on the safe side.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's do a process of elimination here. Anything that seems inefficient and expensive as something that I would, remove as soon as possible. And whenever it says that you need to create several tables, like do the same thing over and over in several regions, that's kind of telling you, that sounds repetitive, not efficient. It also sounds expensive. So that's usually where I start when it comes to discarding options, especially this type of distractors. And now the question is, before we go in that direction, is you have to think in the heat of the moment, is DynamoDB a cross-region service, by default? Like, do I need to enable a certain feature to make it multi-region? And can I do like 3 regions at a time, as the question asks? So these are the questions that they do to make sure that you actually use the service in the past and not just read some FAQ real quick. Because if you use DynamoDB, you will be able to tell this right away, right, Danny?
That's right. So really it comes down to, And again, the question, does us the favor of capitalizing least operational overhead. So probably using the SDK, that sounds like writing code to write code again, right?
Yeah,
It's really
exactly.
going to come down to whether or not this notion of a DynamoDB global table actually exists. And if you have that familiarity with the service, then you know, okay, it's probably going to be answer C or D, since both of those reference global tables. And then from
Exactly.
there, is there this notion of a primary table and read replicas, or is there such a thing as a multi-region, multi-active? And the way that the question is worded, changes seamlessly propagate to the other regions when the table is updated in one region, would lead me to believe that some sort of multi-active scenario would be necessary. So I think between C and D in this one, I would choose C. And that is in fact the correct answer.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we do have one more. I wanted to give an example of a multi-response question. A DevOps engineer needs to implement a blue-green deployment process for an application on AWS. The DevOps engineer must gradually shift the traffic between the environments. The application runs on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer. The instances run in an EC2 auto-scaling group. The application stores data on an RDS multi-AZ DB instance. Route 53 provides external DNS. Which combination of steps should the DevOps engineer take to meet these requirements? So this is an example of a question with 6 answer choices, and we need to choose 3. So we have create a second auto-scaling group behind the same ALB, create a second auto-scaling group behind a second ALB. In Route 53, create a second alias record that points to the new environment. Use a failover routing policy to choose between the 2 records. In Route 53, create a second alias record that points to the new environment. Use a weighted routing policy to choose between the 2 records. Configure the new EC2 instances to use the primary RDS-DB instance, and configure the new EC2 instances to use the standby RDS-DB instance. Now, they aren't always this clear, but usually when you have a multi-response question, all of your answer choices are going to be divided between options for one of the correct answers, and in this case, the second and the third correct answer as well. So you see these neatly fall into 3 bins, A and B. We're probably going to need to choose one of those. Probably going to need to choose one of C or D, and one of E or F. So once we've done that, we can kind of distill each of these answers down to what the differences are between the 2 of them. So let's take A and B to start. We clearly know we need to create a second auto-scaling group. Do we need to do that behind the same application load balancer, or do we need to create a second one for this?
This question looks more to be related to understanding what a blue-green deployment is. So if you've seen an architecture in the past that actually does a blue-green deployment, you'll be able to quickly remember, in the diagram that I see in my head, is there a single load balancer for both a blue and green environment, or is there a separate individual load balancer for each one of the environments? And if I remember correctly, they have their own ALB. Is that correct, Nate?
Absolutely. And another potential clue when reading through this question is this mention of how Route 53 is providing external DNS. So if I wanted to set up different records within Route 53 representing these 2 different environments, I'm going to need 2 separate load balancers for that. So that tells me between A and B, I probably need to choose B. So next, let's look at our Route 53, how we're going to handle these alias records. Do we need to use a failover routing policy or a weighted routing policy? So again, going back to the question, it does mention that we want to gradually shift the traffic between the environments. So will a failover routing policy enable us to do that, or will we need to use a weighted routing policy?
Exactly. Yeah, it's one of those where you have to remember the exact wording or the exact definition of blue-green deployment here. And in this case, you want to be able to say, I want 10% of the traffic to go to the new environment and 90% of the traffic to stay in the all stable and environment that we know is running correctly. So the only way to do that small shift in traffic over time is to use Route 53 weights or a weighted routing policy in this case.
Awesome. So now we know we're going to choose B, we're going to choose D. So now it's between E or F for our third choice. Are we going to configure the EC2 instances to use the primary RDS instance or the standby one? And for this one, you're going to need to know what a standby RDS DB instance is and what it allows and does not allow you to do. So can I send reads and writes to a standby instance? Again, having that experience, having that exposure to these services, you would know that no, in fact, a standby instance is just that. It's a hot standby. It's not going to be available to accept read or write traffic. So I need to configure the new instances to use the primary RDS DB instance.
It needs to be promoted, right? The replica, right?
Right. So based on that, we're going to choose B, D, and E. So hopefully this exercise has been valuable in seeing some example questions, applying some of the strategies we talked about. Again, reading that question, making sure you're reading it from start to finish, understanding that most of the valuable information is probably going to come later on in the question. Eliminating those obviously incorrect answers, going back, rereading the question, using that process of elimination iteratively, arriving at the correct answer. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk through some exam logistics. So in order to book the exam, you do need to have an AWS training and certification account. If you don't have one, if this is your first certification exam, might want to consider taking the Developer Associate and SysOps Administrator Associate exams first, but there are no official prerequisites for the exam, so you certainly can just jump right in and take this one if you have the experience. To do that, you go to aws.training/certification. As of the beginning of 2023, you now are forced to use Pearson VUE as the proctor for the exam. So you can either do that at a test center or via remote proctoring, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Either way, you're going to need 2 forms of ID, at least one government issued photo ID. So one artifact from the pandemic that is still around, they did shift to a fully remote proctoring model for a while. A lot of folks responded well to that. That is still available as an option to you today. But I know, Carlos, I think you probably agree with me. It's probably in your interest to go to a testing center if you have one at all close to you. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. In fact, I just recently booked an exam to go take it in person. The thing is, if you are the kind of person that gets stressed out when it's time to take an exam, you want to eliminate as many variables as possible. And if you're at home, what happens is now you're introducing possible network issues and noises that may not be, to the liking of your exam proctor. And they might say, hey, well, what's going on? What is that? Is that a ringtone? Is that somebody sending you a signal for a potential answer to a question? Those things. And you eliminate all that stuff completely just by showing up to an exam in person. Again, of course, you may not live near an exam center. I understand. You might want to take it, even just for convenience, you might want to do it from home. But, I don't like to add additional stressors, especially to a professional level exam. So I just show up there in time. And, they have their security cameras. They monitor you there. You can even step away from the computer if you need to use the restroom. You just ask your proctor, hey, I'm going to the restroom, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you do that at home, that might be a problem, because they're going to say, well, you're going to step away from the room and you might, consult some documentation that I'm not aware of, and this is going to render your exam invalid and things like that. So again, it's just a personal recommendation. If you can, just take the exam in person.
Well, fully agree with that. And I've done both. And the remote proctoring experience was actually quite stressful. Even you think you're at home, you're going to feel comfortable, but you're being watched the entire time. I know a lot of folks have a tendency maybe to just even mouth the questions to themselves as they're reading through them on the screen. That's not allowed with remote proctoring. The proctor will step in and say, hey, you need to stop doing that. You can't have any pen or paper handy. Often at a test center, they'll at least give you some sort of erasable whiteboard that you can use. So for all of those reasons, not to mention all the things, network issues, your internet goes down, your power goes out, your Windows update, critical update decides to restart your machine in the middle of the exam. All of those factors play into me at least preferring the test center experience. So how do these exams differ? Well, the good news between DOP-C01 and C02, it is a fairly incremental update. So comparing the two sets of domains from the 2 exam guides, you can see we've laid them out side by side there. they're actually quite similar. So a couple little, adjustments to some percentages within the domains here and there. But domains 1 and 2 are exactly the same, with just a small change in the percentage weighting of domain 2. For domain 6 from the first exam, that was just renamed from high availability, fault tolerance, and disaster recovery to resilient cloud solutions. Likewise, domain 4, policies and standards automation, was renamed to security and compliance. And you see that domain 5, incident and event response, was also unchanged, with the exception of just, again, a small change to the percentage weighting. So we've seen this with a number of the AWS exam updates over the course of the past year, from the advanced networking specialty last summer, the solutions architect associate, solutions architect professional, as well as the developer associate exam, which just went live earlier this week, that update. These have all been just incremental updates. So there may be some new services that are in scope. And in fact, for this particular exam, there are about 40 new services that are in scope that were not in scope for the previous version of the exam. Obviously, we're not going to know until the exam goes live next week and we start to sit the exam and we start to get that feedback from our learners. But again, based on the experience we've seen with these other exam updates over the course of the past year, it's going to be really at a recall level for most of these services. They're mostly just newer services that didn't exist when the prior version of the exam was created. Obviously, a service has to be around for at least 6 months before it is in scope or can be in scope for certification exam questions. We do have a blog post that is linked from this slide here that spells out all of the updates to both this as well as the developer associate exam. You may have joined us for that webinar we did last week. So encourage you to read through that blog post and get a sense for what some of the updates are. But again, questions are of similar complexity. If you've been studying for the prior version of the exam, you didn't get to book it in time, you didn't get to sit it in time, your studying and your work so far has not been in vain, and you should feel very confident pursuing this new version of the exam as well. So we often get asked questions like, how should I prepare for the exam? You want to give yourself plenty of time to consume all of the learning materials available to you, gain that hands-on experience. That's obviously a big component. Is it possible to pass an exam like this without ever laying hands on an AWS console? It is. It certainly is much more difficult though, and that's why they do encourage you to have at least that 2 years of hands-on experience before you sit this exam. Identify your weaker areas. So as you go through the exam guide, as you're going through these courses and sample exams and things of that nature, it should become obvious to you where your weaker areas are, and that will allow you to then focus your studying efforts on those weaker areas instead. Reach out and ask questions to those of us using AWS. So we have a Discord community that I'm going to talk about in just a minute here. That's obviously one resource. Obviously, you can reach out to us here at Cloud Academy, support@cloudacademy.com. You hear it in all of our courses. Reach out to us. One of our cloud experts will reply to your question. Study, 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 and we will have a learning path coming very soon, no later than Monday next week, that will cover all of the different services and focus areas and the domains that we've talked about from the exam guide. So it looks like we haven't had any questions yet. I know we are getting close to the top of the hour here, but hopefully this has been valuable for all of you and had an opportunity to answer some of your questions. Again, talk through that exam guide, some of the differences between the old version of the exam and the new one, and just going through that process of answering some example questions as well. I'll wait to see if any other questions come in the next minute or two here, but I mentioned this earlier, we will have that learning path coming soon. Keep an eye out for that. Obviously, we'll be posting about that on social media, as well as within our Discord group. So new courses, hands-on labs, lab challenges, knowledge checks, and most importantly, a preparation exam that has a pool of questions that is more than just 75 questions. So you can take that preparation exam multiple times. You'll get a new set of questions every time, and really helps you to kind of narrow down your focus areas and where you might need to do some additional studying. And when it comes to reaching out to folks, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that this is an exam update. There was no beta period, right? So nobody has seen the actual updated questions, right? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. The last thing I want to mention,
even for us, should be fun.
That's right, and we'll all be sitting the exam soon as well. So As you get an opportunity to sit this exam, please give us your feedback. Once the learning path has been published, encourage you to go through that and let us know about your exam experiences as well. And one place you can do that is in our cloud developer community, which is hosted on Discord. So join our Discord. There's a link on the slide here. Definitely encourage you, and I think the link has been posted in the chat window as well. Sign up for that. Carlos and I are in there all the time. We're posting about new content, new courses. We'll definitely post there when the new learning path is released, as well as just Q&A about study tips and different questions that you might have as you are going through it. So I did see a question come in. How does someone with a Linux background take this exam without much reading or studying? It's going to be tough, especially if you don't have the AWS service experience in particular. So good to have that Linux background. That might give you some background in the systems administration, maybe the ops portion of DevOps, but it is going to be, I would say, challenging without the kind of commensurate AWS experience as well. What do you think about that, Carlos?
Totally agree. Especially, I don't know if this person has the development background or the operational background. I'm gonna guess it's on the upside. But yeah, you definitely need at least some developer experience from the AWS perspective, because there's going to be plenty of code build, code pipeline, and code commit as well.
And if you haven't taken the developer associate and or the SysOps administrator associate exams, I think those might be a good place, or maybe a better place to start than this one in particular. Pass those certifications, get that experience, get that exposure to how AWS exams are structured, how the questions work. And then use that 50% off voucher to register for this one after that. With that, I see we've gone a couple minutes over, so thank you all for sticking with us today. Definitely appreciate your time and wish you the very best of luck. And with that, I will hand it back to Doina.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Amazing session. Thank you, Danny and Carlos. Really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise with us. This concludes today's webinar. Please don't forget to complete the survey at the end. It will help us improve our sessions. Thank you once again for joining us. Have a wonderful day.